The curse in the Lucidarium says, "Therefore cursed be the person who would hand over this treasure into the hands of the sinners, and may his life on earth be short, and the curse of the wrath of God be upon his head and upon his children, and may his enemies seize him and devour his soul."
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so excited to discuss the elucidation of necromancy with scholar and author Joseph H. Peterson. Joseph Peterson really needs no introduction for those who are interested in grimoires and Solomonic magical manuscripts and translations. In fact, when it comes to double-checking what a grimoire says, or searching the name of an angel, or cross-referencing a source, thousands and thousands of people have and will continue to visit Joe's award-winning website, esotericarchives.com. That's where Joe shares his translations and publications of hundreds of grimoires and also reference material. Joe's publication of the Lemegeton about 20 years ago, to me, really helped kick off a new effort by scholars to translate and publish new source works of magic, either in critical editions or translations of one specific manuscript. And Joe's scholarly research and translation efforts are most recently reflected in his new book from Ibis Press, entitled The Elucidation of Necromancy, where Joe translates, contextualizes, and presents 3 manuscripts of the Lucidarium that recently came to light, as well as a new translation of the incredibly important and influential Heptameron, or magical elements, attributed to Peter de Abano. This is incredible for so many reasons, but also because the Lucidarium manuscripts provide the first major update to our understanding of the Heptameron in more than 500 years. In this podcast, Joe shares about how the Lucidarium manuscripts are connected to the Heptameron, how they fill in the gaps that the Heptameron leaves out or omits, and Joe also talks about the connection between the Abbot Tritemius and the Lucidarium. And also Joe shares the powerful curse in the Lucidarium, warning those who are reading the manuscript, and so much more. I also want to thank each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your wonderful questions for each of our guests. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Joseph H. Peterson. Joseph H. Peterson, thank you so much for stopping back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thanks, Alexander. I really appreciate your inviting me. I know we've been talking about doing this for some time, and I'm glad to finally get the opportunity to sit down with you.
The honor is certainly mine. I mean, for me, the last 2 years have just been kind of a front row seat into your scholarship and your research, as well as your discussions with Adley Nichols, Andy Foster, Mihai Vartajaru, and others. And Joe, your latest book here, The Elucidation of Necromancy, it provides the first major updates and context around the Heptameron in the last 500 years, effectively. But before we get to that, Joe, could you just share with listeners who might not be too familiar about the Heptameron itself, or the elements of magic? What the heck is this text?
The Heptameron is a short magical text that appeared in 1559, Marburg, Germany, and has quite a lot of influence on other magic texts ever since. It's become one of the more influential grimoires or magic texts that I know about. As best I can tell, according to Dr. Thomas Willard from the University of Arizona, a heavy edit or compilation of Jacques Gohary, who ran a school of magic in Paris around that time and was probably responsible for a number of magic texts, including the Archidoxes of Paracelsus and the Arbatel. It's a very interesting text. As I said, it was short. It's very easy to implement. There are no exotic ingredients or requirements for people to practice that type of magic. And so it became very popular and incorporated into a lot of workbooks of working magicians and others who are interested in the genre.
As you mentioned, Joe, the Heptameron that we all know and love from Turner came about 100 years after the Latin printed edition in 1559. But as we often hear, there was this other reference to a manuscript or a work that Peter de Abano made even 50 years before the 1559 Heptameron in 1508, when Tritemius is condemning a text called the Elucidarium Necromantiae Petri de Apano. Can you just share with the listeners about the connection, perhaps, between the Heptameron and Tritemius and this Lucidarium text that Tritemius is talking about?
Sure. The abbot Trithemius was actually a teacher. People probably have heard of him before, but he was a teacher of both Paracelsus and Agrippa, and collected one of the largest monastic libraries at the time, including a lot of magic texts, which he did catalog and condemn some, and some he praised. But we owe a lot of information to him and his efforts to talk about some of the texts in this genre. And as you said, in 1508, he published this catalog and referred to the Lucidarium Necromantii. And it was not apparent from Trithemius's description what its relationship to Heptameron was, but it sounds very similar to what we know of as a Heptameron from the 1559 printed edition and Turner's later English translation. Now, Nowday in 1669 talked about it and the other works attributed to Trithemius and seemed to think that it was a separate text from the Heptameron, but that was not readily apparent from any of the information that he provided or that others provided at the time.
One of the many things that you trace in your book as well, The Elucidation of Necromancy, Joe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that Tritemius also, as he's condemning this seemingly separate work by de Abano, he gives an incipit, multi experimentatores diverse monde apparantur in haec scientia divina. And this incipit, this introductory line, is not found in the Heptameron of 1559.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it is one indication that it's a separate text, or at least not identical to the Heptameron, because this introduction that he quotes does not occur in the Heptameron.
So we have this Heptameron of 1559. We have this seemingly separate text that Trithemius is condemning in 1508. Before these three manuscripts that you have in your Elucidation of Necromancy came to light, can you share a little bit about what did we actually know about the Lucidarium before these manuscripts came to light? I believe it was in 2013, the scholar Julien Veronese, pardon my horrible pronunciation, wrote a little bit about the Lucidarium.
Yeah, just a little bit before that, I have made note in a number of places in my publications the complex relationship between Heptameron and some other texts, in particular the Sworn Book of Honorius, Raziel, Astromagia. And I could tell from editing these texts that there was some relationship between them all, but the exact relationship was very difficult to piece together. And so when I started studying the details of the Lucidarium, I was able to help fill in the picture. As you mentioned, Julien Veronese published this book in 2013, which was titled Medicine, Astrology, and Magic in the Middle Ages, and in particular covers the case of the texts that were attributed to Peter of Abano. It was actually edited by Jean-Patrice Boudet, but Veronese had a large contribution to that volume, including this analysis of the Lucidarium. And in it, he goes into great length in describing the contents of the text based mostly on the Vatican manuscript. And he includes large excerpts from the text as well, but it was an important study and commentary on that. And as I said, a detailed description of the text based largely on the Vatican manuscript.
So speaking of the Vatican manuscript, VRL 1115, to go back to simpler times, Joe, in October of in October of 2019, I remember that month very well. Mihai Vartajaru, when he was on the podcast, also mentioned this manuscript. And it was in October of 2019 that you first started looking at this manuscript in detail. As a scholar, as a translator, as someone who's done this, right? The Ars Forbidmidar, countless of books of Moses, everything you've done. What were your first thoughts after viewing VRL 1115 for the first time?
Well, this is probably a good opportunity to thank you for your contributions on this, because you and Adley largely were responsible for dragging me into this wormhole. I was working on some other texts, and the questions kept coming up on the Heptameron, which I had a version of on my website for many years. It was one of the first magic texts that I analyzed. In fact, I should mention I had major revisions to that version in terms of when I was able to find additional editions of the Latin text and determined that the one I had been using was corrupted or had a lot more errors than some of the better ones. Then I would completely revise the text. So it was something that I've been following for quite a while. But then this Vatican manuscript came up of the Lucidarium, and this is a good opportunity to understand more about the evolution of the text, the relationship between the Lucidarium and the Heptameron. When I first looked at it, I got the link from either you or Adley, but it was ultimately passed on from Mihai. And it was very hard to read. It's very difficult because of damage from the acidic ink. But a lot of the text was parallel to the Heptameron, although reorganized quite a bit. And there's a lot of material that doesn't match up exactly. So ended up using different photographic techniques to try and provide sharper images. Actually, one of the best techniques is one I got from you, which is the adaptive equalize filter along with the sharpening. I did use that in some other filters that I have used in the past with the Book of Oberon and other manuscripts. But yeah, it was a very difficult manuscript to read. The calligraphy itself is somewhat difficult, but just the fact that there's so much discoloration and damage in it made it a big challenge.
And so, Joe, to that very point, when it comes to VRL 1115 and its background and relationship, can you give us some details about this manuscript? I know Queen Christina of Sweden comes into the picture as well.
The manuscript was completed in 1569, so quite a bit before Queen Christina acquired it. If people are not familiar with her, she was the reigning monarch of the Swedish Empire in the 1600s. And she was also a brilliant scholar and collected a large library. And this is one of the manuscripts in her library that was eventually transferred over to the Vatican and is now part of the Vatican archives.
How did you go about translating and surveying VRL 1115? As you mentioned, it's very difficult to read. You were using this, very cool technology to read it. But did you go line by line? Did you look at one area in the Heptameron and then compare it? Or how did you do that?
Well, I have kind of a strange technique, and it may not be the best, but it's the way that I typically work. And that is I approach it cyclically. I take the easier parts of the text and I transcribe the whole thing as I do, move from one to the other, incorporating comparisons with other texts and manuscripts. And the translation kind of follows the same technique where I'll translate the simpler parts and then move on to the stuff that's more complicated or harder to read. So it's not really line by line or systematic. And then it kind of all falls together at the end where I can see the complete text in context, and then I'll proceed to refine some of the translations to be more consistent, use the same terminology at different points of the text.
Ah, that's fascinating. And Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you first started looking at VRL 1115, you were looking at the first text, complete text, that also had the exact incipit that Trithemius was mentioning in 1508, multi experimentatores, et cetera, et cetera. So can you share about just the importance of, even though the book was written, as you mentioned, composed in 1569, so later, about 50 years after Trithemius, why it was so important that the incipit matched what Trithemius was referencing?
It was clear that this manuscript was based on a text. He was copying it from an earlier source that essentially represents what Trithemius had in his hands, in his library. So although the manuscript was written down and it to some extent influenced by the later Heptameron, it's clear that it largely represented what Trithemius would have seen.
Can you walk us through, Joe, as this is going on, all of a sudden there's another text that comes to light and then another text. Can you just give us some of the broad strokes about these other two texts, the Gent Manuscript and then VSG 334?
Well, you've hit on a very interesting issue and kind of a nice problem to have with publishing this type of material, and that's that things become obsoleted so fast. Manuscripts are being digitized and cataloged at a phenomenal rate these days. And we knew about the Gent manuscript from Veronese's chapter that we talked about earlier, but this was an extremely important and interesting manuscript. It was found in the process of demolishing a fireplace in an old mental hospital, along with some ritual implements that were clearly used by a magician at some point in the past. And the manuscript itself was heavily damaged, but a lot of it, including, fortunately, the luchadarium section, is largely, almost completely legible, although it's difficult to read. And when comparing it with the other manuscripts, I was able to get a complete sense of the text and reconstruct the passages that were damaged. But the manuscript itself is a composite manuscript. It has a lot of different magic texts in them. In fact, a large number of texts that it includes were in the list that Trithemius had published of magic texts that he was familiar with. So it's almost like you're seeing the actual text that Trithemius would have seen. That was a very good find. It's a little bit shorter. I wouldn't say that the text is completely defective in that respect, but it seems like whoever compiled it, for whatever reason, tried to shorten it by removing unnecessary verbiage and things that he considered obvious, like some of the tables of hours. He didn't complete all of them, saying, this follows the same pattern, that sort of thing. The third one that I was able to find was there was an old catalog published by Scherer in 1864 of the library of the Vadian, who was a reformer. And the description in that catalog, he had identified an Abano text, which he referred to as Lucidarius. And I was able to contact the Vadian St. Gallen archivist and eventually was able to get photographs of that manuscript. It was a long process because of the COVID. They were having a lot of delays and staff shortages and things, but eventually I got high resolution photographs of that entire manuscript, and that proved to be one of the most valuable of all of them. Having the three of them, and if you include the Heptameron, 4 major versions of the text, it really fills in the picture quite a bit.
Didn't you mention too, I think it was one of our conversations, just that one of the things that should be on every good scholar's mind is we need more manuscripts. We need more manuscripts. So, and then all of a sudden here there were, 3 of them that you're looking at. And one of the things that you did, Joe, too, that I think is just so wonderful. And I know when listeners pick up their own copy of your book, The Elucidation of Necromancy, that they can enjoy too, which is you really sketch out the kind of pedigree or the evolution of the different manuscripts. So the lineage potentially, and what could constitute an text, for example, an original text. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, the whole technique of textual criticism and editorial technique is something that's been codified for quite a few decades, but it's very difficult to apply in some cases, in some genres. It works better when you have lots of manuscript to witness the text, especially difficult when the texts are so fluid. When you compare the 4 major versions that we have today, there may obviously, hopefully be more tomorrow, but when you compare them, it's very apparent that there is a lot of fluidity. Each of the scribes that was responsible for their manuscript made changes or incorporated materials from their source material that was different from the others. Typically, what you would do with the standard textual criticism is to identify the errors, whatever differences you can find between the manuscripts. You identify which of those could be considered errors in the text, and then you look for those errors in subsequent generations of the text. In the case of the Heptameron, this turned out to be a lot simpler than I thought it would be, but the Lucidarium itself was a lot more complicated because the different versions are so different from each other. So there's a lot of considerations, but I'm typically looking for things like Bible quotes or sacred names or quotes from other sources in the text that differ from the original, and you can identify a lot of errors based on that type of analysis.
Can you share, Joe, about when is the earliest then, as you're going through this process, that we could potentially date the composition of the very first Lucidarium? Is there an earliest date that we can say it was composed?
I think it's going to be difficult to identify a date more specifically than the late 1400s. Obviously, it would have been in existence sometime before Trithemius talked about it, but I don't think we have, because of the dependence on some of the identifiable sources like the Sworn Book of Honorius and the Key of Solomon and some of the other sources that it incorporates, that we're able to identify anything earlier than that. Clearly, the materials that it depends on are much older, including probably the oldest is the Four Rings of Solomon, Quatuor Annulis, which I think at least goes back to the 1200s sometime. So a lot of older material, including Raziel material. But in Lucidarium as a text, again, the text seemed to be so fluid. It could be that there was a compilation of these texts, composite manuscript with a number of texts concatenated together that was later associated with Abano and might not have even been attributed to him earlier than that.
Yes.
But hopefully we'll get some more manuscripts to clarify that.
As you mentioned too, Joe, one of the conjurations in the Heptameron and the Lucidarium, the Berolonensis, Baldachiensis, Paumachiae, Ethapologe Sedis, these kind of 4 directional thrones or 4 names of thrones. This is something that you point out as well in the book, that something that Julien Veronese also talks about, which is those 4 names are also found in the Cox 25 manuscript, which is, I believe, dated 1460s, maybe 1470s, something like that.
Yeah, the Cox manuscript seems to be the only one that I've found that has a version of the Quatuor Annales, or Four Rings of Solomon, that includes what I refer to as a proto-Berylonensis conjuration, where it has four separate conjurations for the four rings, and these are more elaborate in the Cox manuscript than in other versions of the Four Rings manuscripts that we know of, or that I know of at this point. Not having that manuscript makes it more difficult to analyze, but fortunately, Veronese quotes at length are quite a bit of the material relative to that.
What are some of the main differences between the Heptameron of 1559 that we all know and love and these Lucidarium texts? Because so many people are familiar with the Heptameron, but you found some very interesting and very striking things that are not reflected in the Heptameron.
I actually have a list of 21 differences that I found between the Heptameron and the Lucidarium that I thought were the most significant differences. One of them, the most obvious, is that the text was rearranged in the Heptameron around the days of the week. The Heptameron actually means days of the week, or 7 days, actually. It seems likely to me that the editor, who is possibly or probably Jacques Gohary, coined the term Heptameron when he rearranged the text around the days of the week. That doesn't significantly change the ritual itself, but other differences are surprising. One of the big ones is the attribution of Raphael to the sun as opposed to Michael. And those two traditions go back quite a ways. Abano, the true Abano, had Michael associated with the sun, but the Lucidarium manuscripts have Raphael associated with the sun. So that was an interesting difference and something to try and understand. Another thing is the Heptameron didn't include the descriptions of the spirits, although the Lucidarium did. It was clear that the editor of the Heptameron moved those into the fourth book of Agrippa that was thought to be compiled by Jacques Gohary to try and expand that particular text. Another significant difference, to my mind, is the construction of the circle in the Lucidarium. It has instructions for leaving an opening in the circle for when you enter and leave, and instructions for closing it up. Also the use of the ritual knife, the details about sewing the pentacle onto the garment. Those are some of the major ones. But as I said, I have a list of 21 various differences.
In addition to all that, Joe, which is just truly fascinating, one of the things that struck me that you delineate in the book as well is sometimes the conjurations of the day. There are some conjurations that, just like the Munich Manual, a necromancer's handbook from the 15th century that Dr. Richard Kickheffer talks about in Forbidden Rites, use, conjuro et confermo and then sigillo as well. And I believe VRL 1115 even has zodiacal signs that are in the conjuration of the day, which is definitely not in the Heptameron. So that was pretty fascinating too.
That's true, and probably points back to the origins of that material in some of the Raziel material.
One of the big differences too that struck me that you literally translate and talk about in your book is the introduction to the Elucidarium, where the author mentions why they are writing this Elucidarium, this elucidation of necromancy, and specifically mentioning that they are containing and writing simple instructions so practitioners would not obsess about the trifles. Can you just explain a little bit about what this introduction means?
To my mind, what he was trying to say is that people go to great lengths to follow the specifics of the manuscripts, and not only because of the fluidity, but the different sources that contradicting each other, and some of the instructions being virtually impossible for some practitioners. He's just saying that a lot of that is just unnecessary. You're complicating your practice or not attempting anything because the perfect technique gets in the way of the practical techniques. I think an example might be the preparation of the holy water that you have elaborate instructions for in some of the texts, like the Key of Solomon. He's just saying, just get holy water from a church that a priest has blessed. And so he simplifies the ingredients for the incenses. You don't have to collect 17 different ingredients and put them together, some of which would be difficult for a Northern European to obtain if it's a Mediterranean type of ingredient. So I think that's the kind of thing that he's trying to say with that.
You have written about curses as well in other manuscripts. I believe even on Mihai Vartajaru's blog, he actually curses anybody who would steal one of his posts without attribution or to take it all. And, you know, some of these medieval curses that you've written about before are very, very strong, you know, that damning someone for messing with the pages of this book. And the Lucidarium itself also includes a curse. And I'm wondering, Joe, would it be possible for you to read this curse in English for us and then maybe just share about what it means and just what your thoughts are for it?
Yeah, the curse in Lucidarium says, "Therefore, cursed be the person who would hand over this treasure into the hands of the sinners, and may his life on earth be short, and the curse of the wrath of God be upon his head and upon his children. And may his enemies seize him and devour his soul." So, yeah, there's a number of texts that include curses, and people take them quite seriously. Some people, obviously. I had noted in my edition of the 6 and 7 books of Moses, one of the curses that it includes, and I also included a curse in the Grimorium Verum version that I published. So finding this one in the Lucidarium was a little bit of a surprise.
Do you think, Joe, and obviously this is pure speculation, but do you think that the editor, as you mentioned, of the 4th book was clearly looking at sources that were from the Lucidarium and perhaps passed over this curse and said, well, that's maybe pretty strong. Let's not include that. And I'm trying to make an edited compilation of the 4th book here. So maybe the curse wouldn't have fit or something like that. I don't know.
The Heptameron editor definitely toned things down. That's maybe one of the other differences between Lucidarium and Heptameron that we didn't talk about. But for instance, where the older texts would have the word demon or daemon, he would refer to them as spirits or angels. The whole premise of the collection known as the 4th book of Agrippa that included the Heptameron and some other texts later were more user-friendly, shall we say, and didn't include this particular curse, some of the stronger language.
Yes, and also, Joe, just as the beginning of the Lucidarium manuscripts are fascinating, the end of the Lucidarium manuscripts are so fascinating too. And, you know, readers will enjoy reading the full context, but can you just share a little bit about the ending of the Lucidarium manuscripts, where it mentions that you can basically write any spirit name in the outer circle and you call them using the same exorcisms and conjurations in the rite itself? I mean, have you ever seen a grimoire so encouraging or liberal in its recommendation to use this same procedure?
Well, I think the Key of Solomon itself has a bit of this in there where it's clearly addressed to someone who has other magic texts in front of them, and the techniques that it gives are useful for improving the results that you would get with these earlier texts. So the Lucidarium at the end, as you said, talks about you can use the same types of techniques that he described earlier to improve the results that you would get with following these other magic texts by including the spirit names in the circle and such things that would not be found in the other texts.
Your book, Joe, also includes practical considerations and tips for operators, things that people, if they're looking at the text and they want to, you know, engage in some kind of evocatory procedure, things that they should keep in mind. Can you share about what was your inspiration or reason to include very practical tips as well?
I think a lot of this comes out from just trying to understand the text itself. I especially wanted to give more background or context for the text. And I found that the process of thinking through what would be necessary to reenact this particular ritual helps to illuminate what the text is actually saying. And it can teach us a lot about the text. Plus, I wanted to include some basics from basic warnings like don't burn sulfur indoors, you're likely to damage your lungs and things of that nature, and other practical techniques that would help to put the text in a more understandable context, such as respect for the sacred names, which is typically found and understood by readers in the earlier Middle Ages and the early modern times that we don't necessarily think about in the same way today. So providing some of those practical techniques, I was trying to help understand and appreciate the text a little better. Plus, I found that it was very well received when I included some of that in the 6th and 7th books of Moses, specifics of writing out the names with different scribal techniques and such.
So, Joe, as you're going through all of this and effectively creating these lovely comparisons, translations of the 3 different texts, what were some of the biggest surprises that you came across when translating and comparing the 3 Lucidarium texts?
The biggest surprise to me was just how fluid the text was and how many changes were made by each successive manuscript or series of manuscripts that it represents. I did not really expect that, and it certainly makes it more complicated, but it was clear that everyone who was involved in it had their own take and was quite willing to adapt it. And you see the same thing in later magic compilations and notebooks of magicians and such, like the Sloan collection has, where they incorporate Heptameron material in different forms and take bits and pieces of it or adapt it to suit their particular needs. But I was expecting the 3 manuscripts of Lucidarium and the Heptameron to be substantially the same text. And so just the differences were a surprise.
Overall, it seems like the first third, roughly, of the Lucidarium incorporates a lot of Key of Solomon procedures, consecration of the fire, consecration of the perfumes, etc. And then the middle part, the longest section, is this giant part called the Vinculum Salomonis, the bond or the chain of Solomon. Can you just give us the broad strokes about what the heck is the Vinculum of Solomon? Where does that roughly come from?
The Vinculum is an old Solomonic text, occurs in exorcism manuals and other places, but in various forms can be found in the Key of Solomon and other places. It's a long series of historioli where it says that, for instance, that Moses performed this miracle using these magic names or name, and this miracle occurred. And then it goes on and has another miracle that another patriarch or saint performed. And it eventually includes a similar list of miracles performed by the Christian saints and figures. There's quite a few different versions of it available. It actually helps us to understand the lineage somewhat. But yeah, this was a major part of the Lucidarium and also the Heptameron.
After the Vinculum, the last third of the actual ritual itself, the ritualistic procedure, is basically taken or modified from Liber Iuratus, where you have the prayer to God in the 4 parts of the circle, and then you have the Beryllinensis conjuration. Even though Iuratus does not have Beryllinensis, it starts with Genio Liacidae, and then after that you have, in the same order as Iuratus, you have the Actinomos or the Achinomos conjuration. Do you think the author was just kind of sitting at that desk in the 1400s and just kind of compiling things intentionally, systematically, or?
Yeah, a lot of the material was taken from the Sworn Book of Honorius, as you mentioned. And he seemed to have had a pretty good copy of the Key of Solomon as well as the Sworn Book and some of the others. But I think he was trying to put it together into a working form, and all of this material ended up towards the end of the manuscript ritual, but it does not include a lot of the preparatory rituals from the Sworn Book. So he was pulling things systematically from his source text to assemble it into a scheme that could be relatively easy to work.
In addition to these three texts that you translate and the context and the practical tips and tracing out the lineage, you also include a new translation of the Heptameron itself. Can you just share with us? I mean, so many people, I know myself, and I know thousands of others, go to your website, esotericarchives.com, and check out the Heptameron. What were some of the biggest updates or tweaks or changes that you found as you went through the Heptameron itself, now bathing in the light, so to speak, of the Lucidarium manuscripts?
I don't actually have a list handy, but the translation from Turner that was done, as you said, in the 1650s, had a number of problems with it. And just the fact that its language has somewhat evolved since then makes it necessary to include a lot of explanations and put things into context. So I ended up accumulating a large number of footnotes around Turner's translation and the Latin version, to the point where I thought a whole new translation was merited. The Turner translation has been published a number of times, but I wanted to do one that was more informed by the Lucidarium, including some of the corrections to the names and just footnotes to explain things a little bit better.
What is the legacy of the Lucidarium? How should readers of your book, The Elucidation of Necromancy, and also practitioners consider the Lucidarium in the context of the 1559 Heptameron, or even by itself? Like, what should the legacy be?
As I mentioned earlier, the text was used heavily by practitioners of magic in a large variety of manuscripts and working methods. So clearly it's useful for understanding the whole genre. I would say critical to understanding a lot of other magic texts. The Lucidarium helps to correct a lot of the errors that crept into the Heptameron printed text, especially the translation of Turner. So just understanding the whole lineage, where it drew its source materials from, and how it was utilized by subsequent generations of practitioners. I think that's the legacy.
We had a listener, speaking of VSG 334, the very beautifully written manuscript. A listener was asking, is there a ritual triangle mentioned in the Lucidarium like that of the Goetia? Can you share about anything with that, Joe?
One of the interesting things about the Vedian manuscript is it has a different design for the magic circle, and it includes a couple of different designs. And it was clear from the scribe's notes in the text that he had a couple of different copies in front of him. But the main magic circle that he renders in the manuscript or one of them, is more elaborate than what's in the other manuscripts, and includes this triangle in the corner, which is referred to as the Triangle of Bilith. So that's the triangle where the spirit Bilith would appear. It's clear that this is from the Book of Bilith or something similar to that, one of the older magic texts that ended up influencing this particular circle design. The triangle didn't have any magic words or symbols or anything. It's just a basic triangle. Interestingly, it occurs also in the Hebrew translations or the Hebrew texts of the Heptameron that were included in Galanz's publications and the Oriental manuscript and the other Hebrew texts that we know of. So there is a tradition for that. But yeah, it's one of the few that incorporates a triangular design. The Sworn Book of Honorius And of course, the Goetia have similar directions that you should make. What Honorius refers to as a spirit throne. It's a place that the spirit is supposed to appear at, and that would be in the direction that the spirit's invoked. So it's tied to the cardinal directions in the offices of spirits, texts, and traditions that is now largely lost from the lesser key manuscripts, but there's some vestiges of that in the Folger manuscript and some of the other texts, but it's not an elaborate triangle at all.
Joe, as well, you were mentioning, of course, Peter de Abano himself, the true Peter de Abano. And to that point, we have a listener question for you from Douglas of What Magic Is This? And Douglas is asking, I'm just wondering, Joseph H. Peterson's 2 cents, is Peter de Abano the author of the Heptameron or not?
I think it's pretty clear to me that I'm convinced that he was not responsible for the text. Just the fact that he was tried by the Inquisition for not believing in the existence of spirits and some of the other differences with his condemnation of magic and such, I think it's pretty clear that this was a later compilation that was trying to take into account his association after his death with magic practices.
We also have a listener comment from Stephen Civadelic, who is saying, I have no question, but myself and my coven would like to just give a massive thank you to Joseph H. Peterson for his translation and printing of the Secrets of Solomon, and to Joseph H. Peterson and to Adley, Andy, and Mihai for their work towards bringing the elucidation to us. I could not agree more with that. And I think that actually kind of goes to, is there anything on the horizon, or do you have any other potential leads, or perhaps somewhere in the misty future, we might have a 1400s luchadarium that is just waiting in a library somewhere? Is there anything that comes to mind about future manuscripts?
I haven't found any additional manuscripts of luchadarium, but I think it's likely that we will find some at the rate at which things are being digitized now and cataloged. A lot of times it takes going through them page by page in some other context for someone to see the connection. Lucidarium is probably going to be one of the easier ones to identify because of the distinctive sigil designs and such, which people would recognize if they're paging through a text. One sort of related note, I was recently looking at one of the major manuscripts of the Sword of Moses manuscript that was recently published by Jubal Harari, and going through that early Hebrew manuscript, I found a version of the Almadel that I don't think anyone had noticed before. And it's very interesting addition to our knowledge of the Almadel tradition, which is also a fairly straightforward and interesting magic text that was earlier than a lot of the other ones. So I think it's quite likely that as new manuscripts are digitized, someone will recognize them as being related to luchadarium.
Is there anything else, Joe, that you'd like to just leave listeners with? Anything that we haven't discussed that you found going through this process of translating the 3 luchadarium texts? What else would you like listeners to know about this book?
Well, again, I want to thank you and Adley, Mihai, for pushing me through this project. There was constant questions as we were going through it, and I'd move forward or backwards in the manuscript. As I said earlier, I kind of go through in a circular fashion, but I kept refocusing and focusing, and it ended up adding a lot to the overall project and just keeping the momentum going because of the enthusiasm that you 3 showed for the whole project. So much appreciated. It was a fascinating text. It was one that I had been puzzling over and mentioning in context of other texts that I'd edited before, and a great opportunity to try and clarify some of the issues and points of confusion.
Well, Joe, that is incredibly high praise coming from you. And it certainly was an honor. And in fact, I was just chatting with Adley a couple days ago that we were just talking about the general characteristics that make a magician. And one of them certainly is obsession. And so if you can put up with our incessant questions and copious amounts of coffee on my end, that is certainly wonderful. Thank you so much. And Joe, can you share a little bit about where people can pick up a copy of your book? Of course, listeners, check the links below. This is from Ibis Press, and people can pick up a copy on Amazon. But is there anywhere else, Joe, that you'd like to direct people to?
You can order the book directly from Wiser Books, people who don't want to go through Amazon, but they are the major distributor for Ibis Press, redwheelwiser.com. It's available for general distribution as well. So your local bookstores, I encourage people to buy from their local bookstores as well.
100%. Yes. Shopping local. So important. Joe, too, we also have just a few unrelated questions for you. One listener question is from patron Sean McCleaver. And Sean is asking, does Joseph Peterson know the origin of the even-numbered days of the moon? This requirement is absent from the Hygromantia manuscripts, which recommends a full moon.
That's something that I have not looked into in any great detail. I'm not totally sure. I know that it's found in the Folger manuscript, which we published some years back as the Book of Oberon. It might be in the Raziel, but I think the earliest I'm aware of is the Thesaurus Spirituum, which is sometimes attributed to Roger Bacon or other Bacons, but that was like a mid-15th century magic text that Trithemius also condemned in his 1508 listing. But that's the earliest one that I'm familiar with, but it could very well go back much further than that.
Can you share with us a little bit about your future projects? What else are you working on? I know there's a myriad of things, but you mentioned the Almadel and you've been posting on forums about that. Is there anything else that you'd like listeners to know about?
Yeah, as you say, I have a long list of partially finished projects. Actually two that are taking up a lot of my time now are the Almadel and revisiting the Lesser Key to some extent. I just found a new early manuscript of the Lesser Key, which is a very important witness to the text. So I've been incorporating some of those readings into my website and also trying to understand some of the differences that manuscript introduces. But it's another case where new manuscripts are popping up. And as I said, with the Almadel, I found this Hebrew witness to the text, studying that, and I'm actually been putting together a translation of the earlier Latin text as well. That's one of the projects that I'm heavily involved in right now.
Well, we will certainly keep our ear to the ground on all of those projects, Joe, because you are always working on something fascinating. And I think that I certainly join the listeners in sharing the excitement of your projects. Scholar, author, translator. His new book from Ibis Press is The Elucidation of Necromancy. Joseph H. Peterson. Joe, thank you so much again, as always, just for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure talking to you always. And again, I appreciate your contributions to this project in particular.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It was such an honor to have Joseph H. Peterson on the podcast, and I really hope you also enjoy your own copy of Joe's book, The Elucidation of Necromancy. Something I think about so often is that without Joe's research and publications, and without the incredible resource that Joe shares with us on esotericarchives.com, I think the world would be deprived of a resource-rich and context-rich oasis of information on the ever-changing, ever-evolving tradition of grimoire manuscripts, rituals, and practices. Also, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support and for your questions for Joe. Without you, the podcast would not be possible. Glitchbottle has no advertisements or sponsors, literally only you. Only listener support keeps the podcast happening and growing in new and interesting ways. So check out patreon.com/glitchbottle if you'd like to support the channel and also help it grow with exclusive perks. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, elucidate the necromancy, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.